Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to Playing with Power MTG, where we play with the most powerful cards in the most powerful formats. Tonight's game is brought to you by TCGplayer.com, where you can find all of your cards online while still supporting local game stores. Dragon Shield for all of the best accessories to protect your decks, and through Patreon, where you get awesome benefits for your direct support. For tonight's game, we decided to take part in an EDH boxing league. The rules are relatively simple. In short form, you open a box of the product of your choice and build a commander deck from it. After each game, you can open 6 booster packs from a single set and add them to your pool. The only restriction is that you can't open packs from a set you've previously used. After that, it's normal commander. You must select your commander from the cards you open, however. For more details, check out the link in the description. If you want to try out the Boxing League for yourself, pick up some product from TCGplayer.com. They have great prices on sealed products, so you can start a boxing league of your own. Check out the link in the description below. So, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. Going first tonight, we have Ryan, piloting Jodah, Archmage Eternal. Ryan decided to open Dominaria as his booster box for the vast number of legendary creatures he would be able to choose as a commander. This is a 5-color deck that plays huge bomb spells by discounting their cost through Jodah. Ryan's opening hand contains an Opt, Island, Llanowar Scout, Memorial to Folly, Sulphur Falls, and a Forest. Next, we have Mike, piloting Brokkos, Apex of Forever. Mike went with Ikoria for his booster box for the great synergy of Mutate and for the huge creatures that are part of the set. This is a 3-color Mutate deck which utilizes the synergies and value that Mutate brings to the table. Mike's opening hand contains a Dismal Backwater, 2 Islands, a Forest, Migratory Greathorn, Hunted Nightmare, and a Dreamtail Heron. Going third tonight, we have Zach, piloting Tazri, Beacon of Unity. Zach decided on Zendikar Rising for the different archetypes of party and kicker that allows you to build a low to the ground and synergistic deck. This is a 5-color deck that utilizes small creatures with good utility that are part of the party mechanic. Zach's opening hand contains an Island, Mountain, Scale the Heights, Bright Climb Pathway, Smite the Monstrous, Lithiform Blight, and his London Mulligan is the Spoils of Adventure. Finally, we have Folger, piloting Golos, Tireless Pilgrim. Folger decided on M20 for one reason, and that was Golos. M20 has the perfect amount of color fixing, huge spells, and payoffs to make Golos shine. This is a 5-color big mana deck that seeks to ramp into Golos and activate him as many times as possible to accrue value and cheat huge spells into play. Folger's opening hand contains a Temple of Triumph, Temple of Mystery, Swamp, Renowned Weaponsmith, Scampering Scorcher, and a Chandra, Awakened Inferno. Without further ado, let's commence this convoluted collaboration of captivating carnage. Ryan wins the Social Distance Rock Paper Scissors tournament and gets to start us off. Ryan draws a card for turn and then plays an island. He taps the island to cast Opt. He scries to the top and draws a card and passes the turn. Mike draws for turn, plays a Dismal Backwater gaining 1 life, and passes the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays an island as his land for the turn and then ships the turn to Folger. Folger draws and then plays a Temple of Mystery. Temple of Mystery triggers, and he scries a card to the bottom and passes the turn. Ryan draws and plays a Forest. He taps both of his lands to cast Llanowar Scout, and then passes the turn to Mike. Mike draws a card for turn, plays a Forest, and then passes. Zach draws and plays a Grimcline Pathway. He uses it to cast Lithiform Blight on his Grimcline Pathway, drawing a card, and then passing the turn to Folger. Folger draws a card for turn, and then plays a Swamp. He then casts the best turn 2 play in his deck, Renowned Weaponsmith. This puts the table on high alert. This card allows Folger to cast a turn 3 Golos. With the Weaponsmith resolving, Folger passes the turn. Ryan draws and then plays a Sulphur Falls for turn. He casts Elfame Druid. He passes the turn to Mike. Mike draws and then plays an island as his land for turn. He passes to Zach. Zach draws and then plays a Forest. He casts Scale the Heights, not putting a counter on a creature, and drawing a card and gaining 2 life. He plays a Mountain through Scale the Heights and passes. Folger draws a card for turn and then plays an island. He uses Renowned Weaponsmith to help him cast Golos, Tireless Pilgrim. Golos enters the battlefield and finds a Temple of Epiphany, which triggers, and he scries to the top. Folger passes the turn. At the end of Folger's turn, Ryan activates Llanowar Scout and puts a Memorial to Folly into play tapped. Ryan draws for turn, he plays a Mountain, and then casts Primordial Worm. Ryan ends his turn. Mike draws, and then starts off his turn by playing a Forest. He then casts Migratory Greathorn. He then ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws for the turn, plays a Swamp, and then casts his commander, Tazri, Beacon of Unity. With his card advantage online, he passes. Folger draws for the turn, and then plays a Plains as his land for turn. He taps out to activate Golos. He reveals a Plains, locks it on Life Chanter, and a Jungle Hollow. Folger then casts Loxodon Life Chanter for free and ignores the optional EDB trigger. He passes the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a forest as his land for turn. He casts a Llanowar Envoy and then heads to combat. He swings Primordial Worm at Folger, who declares no blocks and then takes 7. Finished up, Ryan passes to Mike. Mike draws and plays an island as his land for the turn and then casts his commander, Brokkos, Apex of Forever for its mutate cost, onto Migratory Greathorn. This triggers Migratory Greathorn's effect, and Mike searches his library and puts a swamp into play. He ends his turn. Zach draws and then plays a Skyclave Basilica tapped for the turn. He sees the threat of Golos activating every turn, so he casts Into the Royal with Kicker to bounce Golos and draw a card. The spell resolves, Golos returns to Folger's hand, and Zach draws. Zach then passes the turn to Folger. Folger draws and recasts Golos Tyler's Pilgrim. Golos enters and he searches up a Temple of Malady. The temple enters and he scries to the bottom. He then plays Temple of Triumph as his land and scries to the bottom again. He ships the turn. Ryan draws and then activates Llanowar Envoy for white to help cast his commander, Jodah, Archmage Eternal. He then moves to combat and attacks Folger for 7 with Primordial Worm. Folger blocks with both Golos and Loxodon Life Chanter. Ryan assigns the damage to the Life Chanter, then Loxodon Life Chanter and Primordial Worm die. Ryan then casts Nature Spiral to return Primordial Worm to his hand. Ryan then passes to Mike. Mike draws for turn, and then he casts Hunted Nightmare and gives Tazri a Death Touch counter. He plays an island for turn and then goes to combat. He swings his commander, Brokkos, at Folger, who doesn't block and takes 6 commander damage. He passes. Zach draws and starts off his turn by casting Nahiri's Binding on Golos, losing 1 life to Lithiform Blight. This is the perfect answer because it strands a powerless Golos in play. With the threat answered, Zach passes to Folger. Folger draws and plays a Temple of Silence and scries to the bottom. He then casts Scampering Scorchers, which enters and makes 2 elemental tokens. With nothing else to do, he passes to Ryan. Ryan draws and then plays an island for turn. He casts Yawgmoth's Vile Offering, targeting Brokkos and Folger's Loxodon Life Chanter. Mike responds with Keep Safe. It resolves, countering Yawgmoth's Vile Offering, and then Mike draws a card. Ryan then moves to combat and swings Jodah at Folger, who takes 4 commander damage. Ryan then passes to Mike. Mike draws and begins his turn by cycling Zagoth Crystal, drawing a card. He then plays a forest as his land for the turn. He then mutates Dreamtail Heron onto Hunted Nightmare, and Folger responds by casting Murder, targeting Hunted Nightmare. Murder resolves, and Dreamtail Heron resolves without mutating. Mike then moves to combat and sends Brokkos at Folger. Folger declares no blocks and takes 6. Mike then passes the turn. Zach draws and then casts Marasa Rootgrazer. He then moves to combat and swings Tazri at Mike for 4 commander damage. Mike takes it and then Zach passes the turn to Folger. Folger draws for turn and then casts Wing Words, drawing 2 more cards. He then plays a Scarred Barons, gaining 1 life. Folger then casts Silverback Shaman and then ships the turn. Ryan draws and then starts off his turn by recasting Primordial Worm. He moves to combat and sends Jodah at Folger for another 4 points of commander damage. He ends his turn. Mike draws and starts off his turn by casting Corpse Churn, milling Excavation Mole, Bonder's Enclave, and Migration's Path. He then returns the Excavation Mole to his hand. He plays an island as his land for the turn. He casts Fertilid. Mike goes to combat and attacks Folger with Dreamtail Heron. Folger takes it, and then Mike goes to the end of his turn. At his end step, Zach activates Tazri's ability, looking at the top 6 cards of his deck and putting Morog, Fury of Akhom, and Luminarch Aspirant into his hand. Zach draws and then begins his turn by going straight to combat. He swings Tazri at Mike, who blocks with Brokkos, but they trade due to the Death Touch counter on Tazri. In his second main phase, he casts a Lotus Cobra. He plays a Swamp for the turn, triggering Lotus Cobra, making a white mana. He uses this mana to cast Luminarch Aspirant and then passes the turn to Folger. Folger draws for the turn and then slams Chandra, Awakened Inferno. He activates Chandra's second ability to deal 3 damage to all non-elemental creatures. In response, Zach activates Marasa Rootgrazer, returning a swamp to his hand. Chandra's ability resolves and clears some of the board. Folger follows that up by casting Angel of Vitality. Mike responds with an Essence Scatter, countering the Angel. Folger then ends his turn, passing to Ryan. Ryan draws and starts off his turn by casting Grand Warlord Radha. He goes to combat and swings Radha at Mike and Primordial Worm at Zach, triggering Radha and adding 2 mana. Before damage, Zach casts Smite the Monstrous, targeting Primordial Worm. In response, Ryan casts Blink of an Eye, targeting his own Primordial Worm. This fizzles Zach's spell, and then Mike takes 3 damage. Ryan ends his turn. At the end of Ryan's turn, Mike activates Fertilid, searching for a swamp and putting it onto the battlefield tapped. Mike draws and then begins his turn by mutating Brokkos onto the Dreamtail Heron. This triggers Dreamtail Heron, and Mike draws. He plays an island as his land for turn and then moves to combat. He attacks Chandra with Brokkos, killing her. In his second main phase, he casts Excavation Mole, milling 3 cards, and then passes the turn. Zach draws and then plays a swamp as his land for turn. He then casts a Kick Myriad Construct that enters with 9 1/1 counters on it. After that, he passes to Folger. Folger draws and starts off by casting a Yarok's Finlurker. Staring down his hobbled Golos, he ends the turn. Ryan draws, plays a swamp, and for the 3rd time, recasts Primordial Worm. He ends his turn. Mike draws and moves directly to combat. He swings Brokkos at Zach. Zach declares no blocks, and Mike responds by casting Sea Dasher Octopus for its mutate cost. This triggers Dreamtail Heron, and Mike draws. Then Brokkos connects with Zach for 6, and Mike draws off the Sea Dasher's trigger. In his second main phase, he casts Crystalline Giant. He follows up with a Glimmer Bell, and then ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws for the turn, and then casts a Tazine Royal Mage with Kicker. It ETBs, and he returns Smite the Monstrous to his hand. He then passes to Folger. Folger draws and casts a Ferocious Pup, which enters and makes a 2/2 Wolf token. He then passes. Ryan draws, looks around the board, and passes the turn. Mike draws, and then goes to combat. Crystalline Giant triggers, and as Mike struggles to find an 11-sided die, the table realizes that this card was really only meant for Arena. The trigger finally resolves, and Mike puts a Hexproof counter on the Giant. He then attacks Zach with Brokkos. Zach takes it, Sea Dasher Octopus triggers, and Mike draws a card. He casts a Facet Reader and ends his turn. Zach draws for the turn, and then plays a Nimble Trap Finder. He passes to Folger. Folger draws, plays a Plains, and passes. Ryan draws and starts off his turn by casting Divest, targeting Zach. Zach discards Malrog. Ryan follows that up by casting the Mirari Conjecture. The first lore counter hits, and Ryan returns Blink of an Eye to his hand. He ends the turn. Mike draws for the turn and then activates Facet Reader, drawing and discarding. He then moves to combat, triggering the Crystalline Giant and giving it a reach counter. He swings Brokkos and Glimmerbell at Ryan, who takes 7. Sea Dasher triggers and Mike draws a card. Finished up, Mike passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Zach casts Smite the Monstrous, targeting Brokkos. It resolves, and Brokkos dies. Zach draws and then casts Field Research, drawing 2 more cards. He plays a Plains as his land for the turn. He recasts his commander, Tazri, Beacon of Unity. He then proceeds to combat and attacks Mike with Myriad Construct. Mike blocks with his Fertilid, and before damage, he removes a counter to search for a forest and to play tapped. Zach then passes to Folger. Folger draws and plays a Blossoming Sands as his land for turn, gaining 1 life. He ends the turn. During Ryan's upkeep, Mike casts Heartless Act, targeting Grand Warlord Radha, killing her. Ryan then draws and then triggers the Mirari Conjecture and returns Yawgmoth's Vile Offering to his hand. Ryan then sacrifices the Memorial to Folly to return the Llanowar Envoy to his hand, and then passes. Mike draws for turn, and then activates Facet Reader, drawing and discarding. Mike then casts an Essence Symbiote. He follows up by casting Brokkos for his mutate cost onto Crystalline Giant. This triggers Essence Symbiote, and Mike gains 2 life, and then puts a +1/+1 counter on Brokkos. He then moves to combat and triggers the Crystalline Giant, putting a First Strike counter on Brokkos. Mike then ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws for turn, plays a forest, and passes. Folger draws for turn, and rejoices at the card he just drew. He immediately casts Dragon Mage, and with it resolving, he ends his turn. Ryan draws, and then triggers the Mirari Conjecture for the final time, sacrificing it. With the trigger resolving, all of his instant and sorcery spells are copied until the end of turn. Ryan immediately takes advantage of this by casting Blink of an Eye, kicked, targeting Tazri, and the copy targeting Folger's Dragon Mage. Zach responds by activating Tazri, looking at the top 6, and revealing Chijuru Blightblade and putting it into his hand. He activates Tazri a second time, losing 1 life from Lithiform Blight, revealing Expedition Skulker and Glasspool Mimic. Both Blink of an Eyes resolve, returning Tazri and Dragon Mage to their owner's hand. Ryan then draws 2 cards. He then casts a Skittering Surveyor, which enters, and he searches for a basic Plains. He then plays the Plains as his land for turn, and passes to Mike. Mike draws, and then casts Vivian, Monster's Advocate. He then activates Facet Reader, drawing and discarding. Mike casts Karuga, the Macro Sage. Karuga enters, and Mike draws 3 cards from Karuga's ability. Mike plays an island, and then activates Vivian's first ability, creating a 3/3 Beast token with a reach counter on it. He then moves to combat and triggers the Crystalline Giant and puts a flying counter on Brokkos. Mike ends his turn. Zach draws and starts his turn by casting Coralhelm Chronicler. It enters, and he fails to find off the Chronicler trigger. Since Chronicler is a wizard, it gives his Nimble Trapfinder unblockable until the end of turn. Zach plays a Swamp. He attacks Vivian with his Trapfinder, and Vivian takes it and loses 2 loyalty. In his second main phase, he taps Lithiform Blight to help cast Glasspool Mimic. The Mimic enters as a copy of Coralhelm Chronicler, and he reveals a Cunning Gyre Sage. He then recasts his commander, Tazri, Beacon of Unity. He follows up by casting Chijuru Blightblade. Zach then passes to Folger. Folger draws, and then casts a Rabid Bite. This has Silverback Shaman dealing 5 damage to Mike's Karuga the Macro Sage, killing it. He then follows that up by casting a Leafkin Druid. He then recasts his Dragon Mage. Folger then passes to Ryan. Ryan draws and starts off his turn by casting a Gilded Lotus. He recasts his commander, Jodah, Archmage Eternal. With his turn completed, he passes. Mike draws and then casts a Glowstone Recluse from the top of his library through Vivian's ability. The mutate triggers the Essence Symbiote, which puts a +1/+1 counter on Glowstone Recluse and has Mike gaining 2 life. Mike follows up by activating Facet Reader, drawing and discarding. He then plays an Evolving Wilds, sacrificing it, and then finding a forest into play tap. Mike casts Skull Prophet from the top of his library, and then activates Vivian, creating another 3/3 Beast token with a reach counter. He then moves to combat, triggering the Crystalline Giant, giving his Brokkos a lifelink counter. Mike then passes to Zach. Zach draws, and then casts an Expedition Skulker. When the Skulker enters, it triggers Zach's Trapfinder and gives it unblockable. Zach proceeds to combat and sends the unblockable Trapfinder at Vivian and his Myriad Construct at Mike. Mike blocks the construct with his Excavation Mole, and Vivian loses 2 loyalty. In his second main phase, he casts Lull Mage's Familiar and then ends his turn. Folger draws and plays a mountain as his land for turn. He casts Gargos, Vicious Watcher. In response, Mike casts Neutralize, countering the Hydra. Folger then goes to combat and attacks Zach with Dragon Mage. Zach gets hit for 5 damage, Dragon Mage triggers, and all players discard their hands and draw 7. In his second main phase, Folger casts a Howling Giant, which enters and creates 2 2/2 Wolf tokens. Before ending his turn, he casts Pacifism, targeting Glowstone Recluse. He then passes to Ryan. Ryan draws and then plays a Plains. He then taps 12 mana to cast Kamal's Druidic Vow, where X equals 10. The table braces for impact, and Ryan puts 2 swamps, an island, a woodland cemetery, a memorial to Unity, and an In Bolus's Clutches into play. The enchantment then attaches to Brokkos, despite the hexproof, because it doesn't target when putting directly into play. For those about to run to the comments, we confirm this with both a level 1 and a level 2 judge. With a flabbergasted and tilted Mike questioning Magic's existence, Ryan continues his turn by casting Ancient Animus. This has Brokkos fight Folger's Dragon Mage. Dragon Mage dies, and Ryan gains 7 life. He moves to combat and triggers the Crystalline Giant. He puts a Vigilance counter on Brokkos, and then swings Jodah at Zach, who takes 4 damage. Ryan then casts a Damping Sphere and ends his turn. Mike draws and then starts off his turn by casting Extinction Event. Zach responds by activating Tazri, losing 1 life from Lithiform Blight and revealing a Sure-Footed Infiltrator. Extinction Event resolves, and Mike chooses to exile all odd CMC creatures. He then plays an island for turn. He activates Vivian's first ability, making another 3/3 Beast creature token with a reach counter. He finishes his turn by casting Titan's Nest and passes to Zach. Zach draws and then plays an island as his land for turn. He casts a Sure-Footed Infiltrator. The Infiltrator enters and triggers his Trapfinder, giving it unblockable until end of turn. Zach then goes to combat and attacks Mike with the Trapfinder. Mike can't block, but before damage, Zach ninjutsus out the Trapfinder and puts Zerasan, the Trickster, into play. In response, Mike activates Titan's Nest, exiling 4 cards from his graveyard to make 4 colorless mana. He then mutates Pouncing Shore Shark onto Essence Symbiote. Mutate triggers, Mike gains 2 life and puts a 1/1 counter on itself, then returns Zerath back to Zach's hand. Zach then moves to clean up and discards the hand size. Folger draws and then plays an island for turn. He casts Safara, Sky's Blade, and follows it up with a Drakuseth, Maw of Flames. With 2 huge creatures in play, he passes to Ryan. Ryan draws for turn and then plays a Swamp. He casts Final Parting, searching for 2 cards, putting 1 into his hand and putting Multani, Yavamaya's avatar, into his graveyard. He then casts Primeval's Glorious Rebirth with Jodah's ability. The spell resolves, and he returns Multani, Grand Warlord Rada, and In Bolus's Clutches onto the battlefield. In Bolus's Clutches attaches to Drakuseth, Maw of Flames, and Ryan gains control of the dragon. Ryan then casts Helm of the Host. Ryan moves to combat and attacks Jodah at Zach, who doesn't block, and he takes 4 damage. Ryan goes to pass, but at his end step, Mike starts to go off. Mike begins by mutating Dirgeback from the top of his library through Vivian's ability onto Essence Symbiote. Mutate triggers, Mike gains 2 life, puts a 1/1 counter on itself, destroys Dracoseth, and bounces Sephara back to Folger's hand. Then the turn moves to Mike. During his upkeep, Mike's Titan's Nest triggers. He looks at the top card, and he leaves that card on top. He draws, and in his first main phase, he mutates Insatiable Hemophate from the top of his library onto Essence Symbiote. Mutate triggers, Mike gains 2 life, puts a 1/1 counter on the creature, destroys Jodah Archmage Eternal, drains each opponent for 3, and Mike gains 3, then bounces Multani back to Ryan's hand. Mike then activates Titan's Nest 3 times, exiling 3 cards from his graveyard to float 3 colorless mana. With 1 floating from Titan's Nest, he mutates Boneyard Lurker on Insatiable Hemophate. Mutate triggers, Mike returns Dreamtail Heron from his graveyard to his hand, gains 2 life, puts a 1/1 counter on the creature, drains everyone for 4, and Mike gains 4, bounces Primordial Worm to Ryan's hand, and destroys Sure-Footed Infiltrator. Mike then activates Titan's Nest 4 more times to mutate Dreamtail Heron onto Boneyard Lurker. Mutate triggers, he draws a card, gains 2 life, puts a counter on the creature, destroys Grand Warlord Radha, bounces Expedition Stalker to Zach's hand, drains everyone for 5, kills Folger, Mike gains 5, and returns Sea Dasher Octopus from his graveyard to his hand. Mike follows up by activating Titan's Nest 5 more times, making 5 more mana. He uses 3 of the mana to help mutate Cavern Whisperer onto Dreamtail Heron. Mutate triggers, Mike gains 2 life, puts a 1/1 counter on the creature, draws a card, forces each opponent to discard a card, drains 6 from each opponent, kills Zach, gains 6 life, returns Migratory Greathorn from his graveyard to his hand, and then he has no targets for the triggers of Dirgebat and Shore Shark. Mike then mutates Sea Dasher Octopus onto the Dreamtail Heron. This triggers mutate for the final time. Mike gains 2 more life, puts another counter on the creature, makes Ryan discard a card, draws a card, returns Chittering Harvester from your graveyard to his hand, drains Ryan for 7, he gains 7, and then ignores the rest of the mutate triggers. Finally, Mike moves to combat, swings everything at Ryan, and closes out the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what a great ending. Congratulations to Mike on his amazing last turn and win. The mutate synergy that Mike built his deck around turned into a lethal amount of value. The most valuable card goes to Titan's Nest. Mike was able to have an incredible last turn only because of the mana from this card. The combination of free mana and card selection makes this card incredibly dangerous to play against. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. If you liked this video and wanted to help out, please give us a like and consider subscribing if you haven't already subscribed. Also, if you would like to see the raw gameplay of this video, be part of a great community, and have a chance to play with us, consider signing up to our Patreon. There are many tiers and many rewards available, and any support greatly helps us reach our goals. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time. Okay, wanted to give a Patreon shout out to Brandon Harper, Dustin Maillet, Josh Kovach, Josh Kopp, Baby Jeebus, Mox Rob, Trey Payne, Baskin, Zods, Noah Saldana, Wayan, Isaac Kaja, Spielrahu, there he is again, Road Grode Medflowed, CZ, and Nick. Thanks a lot. You guys are all the best.